Guns don't work on Sunday.
I still remember the time I met Tom Selleck in Oahu in the early 1980s when Magnum P.I. was still filming its very first episodes. I was young then, but there is one thing I have never forgotten. He stood there tall, composed, and so effortlessly courteous that one only had to look at him to understand why he was considered the embodiment of the word gentleman. Many years later, when I rewatched Magnum P.I., I realised that the feeling I had back then was not mistaken. Thomas Magnum does not feel like a character being performed, but like a real person living truthfully in front of the camera. John Hillerman, the actor who played Higgins, once said bluntly about his co-star, "He isn't acting at all." But the irony is this, that very non-acting quality nearly caused Magnum P.I. to be cancelled in its earliest episodes. And that was only the beginning. Few people would guess that Higgins, the very symbol of strictness and Britishness, was in fact not played by a British actor at all. Or that Tom Selleck's mustache, initially nothing more than a coincidental physical detail, would unintentionally become a television icon of the entire 1980s. Today, we will reopen the darkest and strangest backstage doors of Magnum P.I. 1980. 20. Higgins, the Englishman who was not English at all. Do you remember Higgins's deep, measured, authoritative voice whenever he stepped onto the balcony of Robin's Nest, a glass in hand, looking at Magnum with an expression that was both disdainful and indulgent? After hearing just a few lines of dialogue, many viewers were convinced that this had to be a genuine English gentleman, so textbook perfect that no passport check seemed necessary. But the truth was completely different. John Hillerman, the actor who played Higgins, was not English. He was born and raised in Texas, USA. He had no British aristocratic background, did not attend an English boarding school, and did not possess the so-called London fog essence that the character projected. Everything audiences believed to be Higgins's natural Britishness was in fact the result of Hillerman's acting skill, linguistic research, and remarkable professional discipline. Hillerman devoted a great deal of time to analysing how the British speak the rhythm of their sentences, the placement of stress, even their characteristic emotional restraint. Higgins's British accent was not showy, but so subtle that it fooled even viewers from the United Kingdom itself. In many later interviews, quite a few people admitted that they had once believed Higgins was a British actor brought over to Hollywood. Ironically, it was precisely this absolute credibility that cast Hillerman into the overwhelming shadow of the role. Higgins became one of the most iconic supporting characters in television history, but also a role that made it difficult for John Hillerman to be recognised as a versatile actor beyond it. Even so, with Magnum P.I., he achieved something rare, transforming an American into the perfect embodiment of the image of an Englishman on global television. 19. Magnum P.I. was cancelled before it officially began. If you re-watch the early episodes of Magnum P.I., you may feel that everything seems strangely in the right place, from the relaxed pacing to Magnum's familiar voice-over narration to the way the story unfolds as if it were always meant to exist. Yet ironically, the series once had no secure place on any broadcast schedule. Hard as it may be to believe Magnum P.I. was nearly terminated before it even began. The project was the creation of Glenn A. Larson, the renowned producer and writer behind Battlestar Galactica, Buck Rogers, In the 25th Century, Quincy M.E., and Knight Rider. Around 1979, Larson developed Magnum P.I. for Universal Television with ABC as its original destination. However, in an attempt at restructuring to rescue ratings, ABC cancelled not only Magnum P.I., but also several other Larson series, including Battlestar Galactica and The Hardy Boys' Nancy Drew Mysteries. The decision failed to produce the miracle they had hoped for. On the contrary, ABC's ratings plummeted severely and took years to recover. Larson then took the Magnum P.I. concept to CBS, where the project was finally given the green light. It became a turning point that reshaped television history in the 1980s. CBS gained an iconic series while ABC missed out on one of its greatest lost opportunities. 18. The original concept, James Bond Hawaii Edition. Do you remember the feeling that whenever Magnum appeared, the entire frame seemed to breathe the spirit of Hawaii floral shirts, harsh sunlight, an unbothered smile, and the mustache that became his trademark? It was precisely that quality of not trying to be cool that made him the coolest of all. According to Screen Rant, Thomas Magnum was originally conceived as a James Bond-style private investigator, polished flawless, the kind of man who walks into a room and automatically becomes its center vodka martinis tuxedos and an almost default allure. The problem was that if the character had followed that direction, Magnum would have become an untouchable monument, attractive, but distant, impressive, but cold, leaving little room for the endearing clumsiness that keeps audiences invested season after season. When Tom Selleck was cast, he pushed the character in the opposite direction. Magnum became an easy-to-relate everyman, relaxed, approachable, wearing Hawaiian shirts and sporting a thick moustache. His decision to draw inspiration from Jim Rockford. The Rockford Files shows that this was not a spontaneous change, but a deliberate character strategy instead of a perfect hero. Magnum became a trusted friend, charming, flawed and grounded in everyday life. Even the choice of car reflects that philosophy. Magnum was initially meant to drive a Porsche, but Porsche would not allow modifications to fit Selleck's physique, whereas Ferrari agreed. A very small technical decision, yet one with major cultural consequences, the red Ferrari became an iconic visual closely associated with Magnum. Not as a display of wealth, but as a signature of the entire series' lifestyle identity. 17. Tom Selleck nearly became Indiana Jones, and why Magnum was his true destiny. Do you remember that raised eyebrow, the half smile, the quiet look, as if he were asking the audience directly? Can you believe this? Tom Selleck turned something so small into a signature style in Magnum P.I, making viewers feel as though they were always in on the joke with the show. But ironically, the man with that very demeanour nearly became Indiana Jones. Steven Spielberg and George Lucas had chosen Tom Selleck for the legendary role, and he even passed the screen test. However, Universal intervened and forced Selleck to give up the opportunity because of his contractual commitment to Magnum P.I. Then, at that exact moment, the Actors' Union went on strike, delaying Magnum's production, a bitter Hollywood paradox. The role ultimately went to Harrison Ford, who brought an Indiana Jones that was decisive, daring, and never doubtful of himself. Yet, it was precisely then that people began to realise that Selleck might never truly have been suited to that kind of hero. Magnum is not invincible. He hesitates, pokes fun at himself, and occasionally breaks the fourth wall with nothing more than a glance. It is precisely that imperfection that makes audiences believe in him. Perhaps for that reason, Tom Selleck's not becoming Indiana Jones was not a loss at all, but a necessary condition for Thomas Magnum to be born and to endure as one of the most beloved television characters of the 1980s. 16. The unexpected connection with Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers. If you have ever thought that Dale in Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers looked oddly familiar, there is a reason for that. The red Hawaiian shirt, the laid-back attitude, the adventurous spirit, all were directly inspired by Magnum. Meanwhile, Chip wears a fedora and a leather jacket evoking Indiana Jones, a role that, as mentioned earlier, was once considered for Tom Selleck. Disney designed Chip and Dale as two contrasting types of heroes, one serious and rational, carrying the look of classic adventure cinema, the other free-spirited, impulsive, and driven by instinct and emotion. That contrast clearly reflects two iconic male leads of the 1980s, Indiana Jones and Thomas Magnum. It is no coincidence that Dale, the messier-joking and somewhat carefree character, wears the signature Hawaiian shirt. Magnum's influence, therefore, did not stop with live-action television. the image of Thomas Magnum seeped into popular culture to the point of becoming a visual code recognizable even in children's animation. The Hawaiian shirt, once seen as simple vacation wear, Shinji a bit sloppy, was upgraded into a symbol of freedom, confidence, and a distinctly American masculinity of the 1980s. So the next time your kids are watching Rescue Rangers on Disney Plus, you can confidently point at Dale and say, "See that chipmunk? He's dressed like the guy who made Hawaiian shirts cool." 15. Making use of the Hawaii Five-0 filming infrastructure. Do you remember the very calm camera work of Magnum P.I? Magnum runs across the lawn of Robin's Nest, not in a tense action sequence, but as if he's hurrying for something very ordinary. The palm trees stand still in the breeze. The distant blue sea serves merely as a backdrop, and the camera almost never pushes, letting the Hawaiian space speak for itself. It is a distinctly 1980s television image, real, open and unshowy. That sense of being truly outdoors was not accidental. It was tied to a practical decision by CBS. The original Hawaii Five-0 had just ended its long run from 1968 to 1980, leaving behind a fully developed production ecosystem on Oahu, filming permits, local crews, experience dealing with island weather, and most importantly, a way of storytelling closely tied to Hawaii's geography. Rather than leaving this golden territory unused, CBS placed Magnum P.I. in that same space, not to remake Five-0, but to tell a different story, more personal, more everyday, yet still built on a proven production foundation. Scenes of Magnum running across the lawn, driving his Ferrari along coastal roads, or standing at Robin's Nest looking out at the sea, are all results of that inheritance. For that reason, Magnum P.I. did not simply borrow Hawaii as a setting. It continued to make Hawaii part of the rhythm of American television. After the Five-0 era, quieter, more intimate, but still unmistakably Hawaii. 14. One of the early series to pioneer a shared universe. As early as the beginning of the 1980s, Magnum P.I. was already doing something that American television at the time had not yet named, placing itself within a shared universe. Not through grand title cards or official declarations, but through characters crossing back and forth between worlds that seemed independent. Magnum met Jessica Fletcher from Murder. She crossed paths with Simon and Simon and shared a distinctly CBS investigative adventure atmosphere with several contemporaneous series. This created a rare sense of continuity. The stories did not exist in a vacuum, but breathed within a common television space, one where rules, tone, and even relationships could extend from one series to another. For audiences, this was a subtle reward. If you followed closely enough, you could spot the connecting threads that casual viewers might miss. There was even once an idea for Quantum Leap to have Sam Beckett leap into the role of Thomas Magnum, a bold move far beyond the conventions of the time. The idea ultimately did not come to fruition, but the fact that it was seriously considered shows that Magnum P.I. was ahead of its era in how it approached long-form storytelling. Long before cinematic universes became a familiar term, Magnum had already been quietly laying the first bricks on television. 13. The original theme song was replaced. What Magnum P.I. theme song is playing in your head right now? In fact, that was not the original music. The pilot episode used a lighter, more relaxed jazz tune composed by Ian Fairbairn Smith. The kind of music you would expect to hear in a smoky piano bar, not while chasing criminals along the beaches of Oahu. The problem was this: the melody was right in mood, but wrong in identity. Jazz evoked a sense of laziness, nostalgia, and introspection, well suited to a classic noir private detective, but not to the version of Magnum that CBS wanted to build: energetic, outdoorsy, action-driven, and imbued with a very prime-time spirit of adventure. Set against images of a red Ferrari speeding along helicopters sweeping over the ocean and a constantly moving protagonist, the pilot's theme simply ran out of breath. As a result, Mike Post and Pete Carpenter were brought in a duo who understood exactly what American television needed from a theme. What they created was not merely background music, but an instant identifier. Within the first few notes, audiences knew immediately that they were watching Magnum P.I. The rhythm was fast, the melody bright and memorable, and flexible enough to suggest adventure while retaining the character's signature sense of humour. The decision to change the music, therefore, was not just an aesthetic adjustment, but a strategic move. It allowed Magnum P.I. to step out of the feeling of a pilot still being tested and become a series with a clear identity, one that decades later can still summon the memories of the 1980s within seconds of hearing its opening notes. 12. The Detroit Tigers cap and a personal touch. Magnum's famous Detroit Tigers cap was more than just a costume piece. It was a personal suggestion from Tom Selleck himself, a true Detroit native, and a lifelong fan of the Tigers. When shaping the image of Thomas Magnum, Selleck wanted the character to have something real and personal, rather than the polished look typical of television detectives at the time. The old, slightly worn cap, worn at a casual angle, was something he brought straight from real life onto the screen. At first, the costume department was not particularly enthusiastic. A baseball cap seemed too ordinary, even uncinematic, especially when placed alongside a red Ferrari and the grandeur of Robin's Nest. But it was precisely that contrast that helped define Magnum. He was not a meticulously dressed gentleman detective, but a former serviceman living comfortably, sometimes a bit scruffy and unmistakably American. The Tigers cap made Magnum look like a real person, not a character designed in a conference room. Over time, the cap became inseparable from the character, to the point that many viewers remember Magnum first through his mustache, and that hat rather than his gun or his Ferrari. It also quietly told a backstory. Magnum had a past, a hometown, a favourite baseball team, and roots that were very much grounded in everyday life. Today, that Detroit Tigers cap is displayed at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Few television props ever achieve that status. And perhaps this is one of the very few baseball caps that have travelled from the ballpark to the film set and then straight into the history of popular culture. 11. The Ferrari was not as fast as you think. Do you remember the feeling every time the red Ferrari burst into the frame, the theme music kicked in? Magnum flashed a smile and hit the gas along the coastal roads of Oahu. It looked like a red arrow slicing through the air, but the reality behind it was far more restrained than imagined. The Ferrari 308 GTS in Magnum P.I. was indeed a visual icon, low-slung bright red with a Targa top and the prancing horse badge, enough to make it the dream car of an entire generation. However, the versions sold in the United States in the early 1980s were heavily affected by new emission standards. The V8 engine's output was significantly reduced from around 255 horsepower in the European models to just over 200 horsepower in many of the versions that appeared in the series. Put plainly, it was not as punchy as it looked. Interestingly, this hardly affected Magnum's image at all. On screen, the Ferrari never needed to be a race car. It only had to look fast, look free, and look like part of the lifestyle audiences dreamed about living in Hawaii, driving a beautiful car and solving cases on one's own terms. In reality, many chase scenes were filmed at fairly modest speeds and then sold through camera angles, music, and the characters' reactions. That symbolic value became so great that years later, a Ferrari 308 GTS Quattrovalvole that appeared in Magnum P.I. sold for more than $180,000 USD. It proved a very television-specific truth. Sometimes looking fast matters more than being fast. And it is the audience's memory that provides the longest-lasting acceleration. 10. Hawaii was a happy accident. Do you remember those sun-drenched afternoons on screen when Magnum drives his Ferrari along the coastline while muttering complaints with the blue ocean and swaying palm trees behind him, as if no crime existed at all? Hard to believe, but that paradise setting did not originally come from some grand artistic vision. In reality, setting Magnum P.I. in Hawaii was simply a practical decision. CBS had just wrapped up Hawaii 5-0 after more than a decade on the air and was facing a familiar television problem. Existing studios, local contracts, tax incentives, and a ready technical crew abandoning them would have been wasteful. Instead of moving elsewhere, they chose the most sensible solution. Continue filming in Hawaii and build a new series around that setting. At first, Hawaii was merely a convenient backdrop, but very quickly it became the soul of the show. The coastal roads, the Robin's Nest estate overlooking the Pacific, the slow rhythm of life contrasted with criminal cases. All of this created a distinctive atmosphere that Magnum P.I. would have lost more than half of its appeal without had it been moved to Los Angeles or San Diego. What is fascinating is that this accident turned out to be one of the wisest decisions in television history. Hawaii not only made Magnum different, but also inspired audiences across the United States and later the world to dream of a distant place where a private investigator could solve cases in a Hawaiian shirt, wear a baseball cap, and end the workday with a sunset over the ocean. Sometimes, the best choices begin simply with not wanting to waste what you already have. 9. Breaking the fourth wall became a signature. If you pay close attention, you will notice some very unusual moments in Magnum P.I. A line of dialogue has just ended. The background music has not yet come in, and Thomas Magnum suddenly pauses for a beat, as if considering whether he should say anything more. Then that look appears. He is not looking at Higgins, not at the crime scene, but straight at you. In the early 1980s, having a main character glance at the camera was almost taboo. Breaking the fourth wall was considered a cheap trick, something that could easily pull audiences out of the story. But Magnum P.I. bet on the opposite. Those raised eyebrows, half smiles, or looks that seem to ask silently, "You see how absurd this is too." Wright created a direct bond between Magnum and the viewer. The key point is that Magnum never speaks directly to the audience. He does not deliver theatrical monologues. He only shares a moment. And it is precisely that restraint that makes the device work. Viewers are not reminded that they are watching a show, they are invited into the story like a quiet companion riding in the passenger seat. Gradually, that look became a hallmark. It set Magnum apart from every other television detective of the era, less severe, less preachy, and far more approachable. You are not just following the case, you are shaking your head with Magnum sighing along with him, and sometimes quietly smiling at life itself. 8. Running gags that kept audiences coming back. You may still remember that feeling turning on the TV without even checking the schedule. And the moment you see Magnum being scolded by Higgins over something familiar, it already feels comforting. Magnum P.I. did not hold on to its audience solely through its cases, but through things repeated so often that they became familiar. The pickled eggs at the King Kamehameha Club were always Magnum's reluctant favourite. Higgins's long, serious war monologues, usually ones no one really wanted to hear, were told again and again. TC constantly reminded Magnum about the unpaid helicopter debt, while Rick always appeared at just the right moment to turn every plan into chaos. And then there was Zeus and Apollo, the two Dobermans who needed no dialogue at all, just their presence was enough to make Magnum miserable and the audience laugh. What matters is that these running gags were never there merely for laughs. They created a sense of a world with memory. Nothing was reset after each episode. Debts remained unpaid. Relationships continued to evolve. Familiar complaints became part of everyday rhythm. It was precisely this intentional repetition that made Magnum P.I. feel more like a family than a crime series. Viewers came back not only to see how a case would be solved, but to meet familiar people again, hear old stories once more, and feel the comforting sense that in this world, everything was still unfolding, just as it had the last time they left it. 7. Magnum rarely killed anyone. If you try to recall all 8 seasons of Magnum P.I., there is something rather unusual despite frequent gunfire, and plenty of chases, the number of people killed by Thomas Magnum's hand is almost zero. In fact, throughout the entire series, there is only one confirmed death directly caused by Magnum, and it is not a moment that is celebrated. This was a very deliberate choice by the filmmakers. The early 1980s were the height of the steel hero era, when the more a protagonist shot, the stronger he was perceived to be. But Magnum was different. He was a Vietnam veteran who had experienced real war, and the series never forgot that. Avoiding having Magnum kill was not because he lacked the ability, but because he understood the cost of pulling the trigger. Magnum's confrontations usually ended with restraint, disarmament, or simply escape. When violence did occur, it always carried a heavy weight rather than a sense of being cool. The single life Magnum took was framed as a psychological trauma rather than a triumph. Because of this, Magnum stood apart from other action heroes of the time. He was still tough, still willing to take risks, but he never became a killing machine. Magnum P.I. chose to remind its audience that sometimes the hardest thing is not firing the gun, but holding back. 6. Robin's Nest was real. You probably still remember those golden afternoons when Magnum would sneak over the fence, run along the stone pathway, and disappear behind the iron gates of Robin's Nest, a place that was both elegant and somehow deeply home. For many viewers, it was not just a setting, but part of the series' very soul. And Robin's Nest truly existed in real life. The estate was actually Anderson Estate, located on the eastern coast of Oahu, Hawaii. Built in the 1930s in a classical European style, the house once belonged to businessman Earl Anderson. When Magnum P.I. used it as a filming location, Robin's Nest instantly became one of the most famous houses in American television history. Interestingly, most interior scenes in the series were shot on sound stages, but the exterior and the overall structure of the estate were entirely real. Because of this, Robin's Nest carried a very different feeling. It did not seem like a constructed set, but like a place that had already existed and only happened to be captured by the camera. Sadly, in 2015, Anderson Estate was sold and completely demolished to make way for a new development. The news left many fans with a deep sense of loss, as if a piece of their youth had vanished. Robin's Nest disappeared in real life, but on screen, it still remains a place where Magnum drove his Ferrari home each evening, and where audiences are reminded that some television icons cannot be erased by time, even when the bricks themselves are gone. 5. Tom Selleck and his generosity toward the crew. There is a behind-the-scenes detail that is rarely mentioned, yet says a great deal about Tom Selleck as a person. When Magnum P.I. entered its final season, CBS decided not to pay bonuses to the crew, a practice not uncommon in the industry, but always a disappointment. Instead of quietly letting it pass, Selleck did something no one asked for and no one expected. He reached into his own pocket and wrote checks for $1,000 to every crew member, from camera operators and lighting technicians to the least visible behind-the-scenes workers. It was not a showy gesture, but simply Selleck's way of saying thank you to the people who had stood alongside him under the Hawaiian sun for 8 seasons. The act spread quickly through the industry, not as a piece of publicity, but as a story passed along with deep respect. For many crew members, the money was not just financial support, but a form of recognition. They were not anonymous names working behind the lights. It is through stories like this that Tom Selleck is remembered not only as Thomas Magnum, but also as one of the last true gentlemen of television Hollywood. 4. Ahead of its time in portraying PTSD, there are episodes of Magnum P.I. that look like a breezy Hawaiian detective series. But when night falls, the show suddenly becomes something very different. Magnum is not just a light-hearted private investigator. He is a Vietnam veteran who never truly left the war behind. This was not accidental. Creator Donald P. Belisario was himself a former US Marine, and he brought that personal experience directly into the scripts. At a time when PTSD was barely named on mainstream television, Magnum P.I. dared to let its protagonist confront nightmares, battlefield memories, guilt, and the sense of alienation that follows war. Magnum can joke, laugh, and solve cases, yet sometimes a single helicopter sound or an offhand remark is enough to pull him back into the jungles of Vietnam. This approach made the character feel real and allowed the series to move far beyond the boundaries of simple entertainment. Years later, when American television began to speak more openly about PTSD, it became clear that Magnum P.I. had been far ahead of its time, quietly, without slogans, and with deep humanity. 3. A true crossover with murder, she wrote. If you remember turning on the TV on a weekend night in the 1980s, chances are you once witnessed a moment that seemed impossible. Thomas Magnum sharing the screen with Jessica Fletcher. In 1986, Magnum P.I. officially crossed over with murder. She wrote a strange pairing between a sun-soaked Hawaiian action detective and the calm, methodical mystery writer from Cabot Cove. On paper, the two worlds had nothing to do with each other. On screen, however, the contrast worked surprisingly well. Magnum brought impulsiveness, intuition, and action. Jessica Fletcher represented reason, observation, and deduction. Neither overshadowed the other, and it was precisely this contrast that made the episode special. From a television standpoint, this was a real crossover, not an awkward promotional stunt. The story was written solidly enough to satisfy fans of both series, and to this day it is still remembered as one of the most memorable crossovers of 1980s television. 2. Hidden cameos in the reboot. When Magnum P.I. was rebooted in 2018, many fans worried that the new series would completely sever its ties with the past. However, the producers chose a more subtle approach. Roger E. Mosley TC and Larry Manetti Rick both returned not in their original roles, but in entirely new ones. This was a very deliberate decision. Instead of trying to recreate old memories, the reboot allowed the actors to step into the new world as familiar faces meant specifically for long-time viewers. Those who recognized them could smile. Those who did not were not affected at all. These cameos were quiet and understated, yet clearly meaningful. They felt like a gentle nod between generations, a reminder that no matter how much time passes, Magnum P.I. has never forgotten where it came from. 1. The moment that defined Magnum P.I. Do you remember that familiar opening scene? The red Ferrari 308 GTS gliding along a coastal road on Oahu, the Hawaiian shirt fluttering in the wind, the theme music kicking in, and Magnum casting a quick glance toward the camera as if he knows you're watching. Just a few seconds, yet enough to be etched into the memory of an entire generation. In terms of story, this scene does not really move the plot anywhere. But in terms of television, it does something far more important. It defines the entire spirit of Magnum P.I. The Ferrari is not just a means of transportation, it is a statement. A private investigator without an office, without a tie, without cigarette smoke-filled rooms, replaced instead by sunshine blue seas and a very American sense of freedom from the 1980s. What is interesting is how real the scene was filmed. No CGI, no elaborate constructed sets. The camera is placed low, capturing the movement of the car and the real Hawaiian scenery, making the audience feel as if they are riding in the passenger seat. Because of that, every curve and every straightaway carries a travelogue quality, but it is not empty. It reflects Magnum's inner world, a love of adventure, an avoidance of constraint, and a constant ironic distance from himself. That Ferrari scene quickly became a cultural icon. People may forget the individual cases of each episode, but few forget the feeling of wanting to drive somewhere far away that the scene evokes. And that is why it is considered one of the series' hottest moments, not because of drama, but because it makes viewers want to live in that world. And those are the strangest behind-the-scenes secrets of Magnum P.I. 1980. If you watched this show back in the days of black and white television, or if any detail in this video surprised you the most, leave a comment below. I'd really like to hear your story. Remember to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.